Hello, and welcome to another episode of My Pocket Psych, the podcast all about the psychology of the workplace. I'm Dr. Richard McKinnon. I'm a chartered psychologist and coach, and this is another of our well-being focused episodes, which forms part of our Thriving at Work series. And you can find out all about that by visiting the website worklifepsych.com/thriving at work. And I'm joined again by a new face on the podcast. I say face, listeners. We also have a video version of this on YouTube. But someone I've known for quite some time, but this is your first time on the podcast. Jane Stewart, you're very welcome. How are you doing?
Hi and welcome. I'm so excited to be here. It is my first time on the podcast. And yeah, I can't quite believe it's that long. We've known each other so long.
Years. So by way of introduction, do you want to tell listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Jane Stewart. I'm one of the co-founders and project directors at World of Work Project, community interest company. And I am also an occupational psychologist in training.
That's a lot, isn't it, to do both of those things at the same time? So well done you. Now, to put all of this in context, you and I and your colleague James co-facilitated a workshop in Edinburgh, where you're based, for context, a few weeks ago, which was all about the evidence base supporting workplace well-being initiatives and helping people become a little bit more evidence-based in their decision-making and their thinking. What I really wanted to do with you today is pick up on that conversation and explore a couple of the themes that we looked at, in particular for all those people who couldn't make it on the day. How does that sound?
That sounds great to me. It was a really interesting conversation, and I've actually been really looking forward to continuing it.
Oh, fab. Look, what were your main takeaways from? We had a whole morning with a group of delegates. What were the things that really struck you?
Well, I had a little note. I wrote down quite a lot in the session, but there's three things in particular I think that I almost stopped me in my tracks. And one is a little bit shame on me because I was talking to a person who works in a local authority in predominantly in HR. And they were talking to me about a team they were working with, and they were talking about how they'd gone in and challenged that team to think a little bit more broadly about why they were seeing well-being concerns in the team and actually unpick their work processes. And I think rather naively, I went into the workshop thinking, no one understands this. And I know best, and we know more because we read the books and, I'm on my learning journey. And it really stopped me short. It was the first conversation I had as we broke out and talked about things. And it just stopped me in tracks. And I thought, the person I was talking to has no real understanding of the principles behind it. They just ask really good questions of their teams and their people. And I was really struck by the power of good questions. And it's something that we talk about a lot at World Work Project, how to ask great questions that stealing mercilessly from people like Edgar Schein and other occupational organizational psychologists. But just struck me in that moment how much the power of good questions helps us delve deeper. And that links to the second thing I was thinking about, and I wrote down, I think I told you this on the day. I feel a little bit like we need to be detectives in well-being work, right? I feel like we have to try and steal or scourge or dig into the information to really try and get to grips with all of the possible things that could be going on. We're never going to understand it all, but how can we understand enough to start thinking about what's going to help people? So that was the second thing I thought about. And I quite like that. I want a detective hat is what I came away about. And also how often I have to try and read between the lines of what a leadership team member is saying within the detective work. And then the third thing I really came away with was just, I don't think this will be a surprise to you, frustrated. Not with the session. The session was great and people were there and present, but the extent to which well-being was being, I'm going to call it programmified, which is not a word. But the idea that someone was being given a budget to do a specific thing within a specific scope, rather than understanding how people's well-being can shine a light on what's going on, help us understand what's going on. And his X hundred or £1,000 or whatever it is, go do and be so that people can be more well, which is just the idea that any one person in an organization can, quote unquote, fix well-being is just a little bit frightening to me. And I don't think that's
Mm.
anyone's fault. I think largely that's how we talk about it in society and in the media at the moment, in terms of, well-being initiatives and things like that. But yeah, I went away feeling a little bit sad for the people who are doing those jobs because it must be very difficult for them.
It's a real challenge. So, I mean, something that we started the morning with was, I think, a reminder to everyone that we want to have empathy and understanding for people who've been given responsibility for this stuff, because it's all too easy to take pot shots from an ivory tower and just complain this is rubbish. But actually, that's not going to change minds. That's not going to help anyone. So actually acknowledging the challenge of maybe someone's been asked, yeah, sort out well-being this year. I mean, that's a huge thing to undertake. And so it strikes me there's really good reasons why someone would then say, "Okay, I need something. Give me something so I can say I've done something." And missing that whole phase that we explored on the day about, asking questions. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? How do we know there is a problem to be solved? Or is this one of those elements of the organizational shopping list, just like an engagement survey and a high potential program? And we need it because isn't that what we need? Rather than, is there something that we actually need here, or are we okay without that? And I think that was at the crux of a lot of the conversation we had to begin the morning.
Yeah, I think so. I did something, probably should have been doing an essay, but actually, when I came home, I had a Google of some of the bigger UK organizations to look at their recruitment material, because I've noticed well-being initiatives creeping into benefits sort of literature when you're applying for jobs and things like that.
Mm.
And I was having a look, and I rather cynically, I was like, "Is there anyone here who talks about, like, work adjustment for amount of work or volume of work or control over work versus the intervention?" And I think the thing that I always think about, and it's not just well-being, I think about it when I think about leadership development as well. It's really important that we unpick or unhook the intervention from the problem, from the impact we're trying to have. And those three things are different, right? And I
Mm.
think, and it's not limited to wellbeing work, but I do see it particularly as people coming in and saying, I would like to do this, whether it's a policy change, whether it's a program, whether it's yoga and fitness and leisure. And they want that solution, even if it's not linked or there's no evidence around it shifting the dial, and also without really understanding why they might have an issue. And I think your point there, most importantly, do they even have a well-being issue? I remember I had a lecturer years ago, and she she said she went into a meeting with a client once, and they said, "We'd like you to improve the well-being of our staff." And she said, "What makes you think there's anything wrong with the well-being of your staff?" And they couldn't say. And it wasn't that there wasn't issue. It was they had no idea really what it looked like, who it affected, who it didn't, why it was showing up, whether it was linked to work, whether it was linked to the world and being brought into work. And they kind of all just sat there. And a little part of me thinks we haven't moved on. And I think that puts people who are doing well-being work in a very difficult place, because they really have to argue
Mm.
against that shiny thing that comes in and is like, hey, our health insurance company have offered us a suite of 5 different things we can take to our staff. Wouldn't that be great? Well, yes, I mean, benefits are great. They're always great. I'm not complaining about that.
Yeah.
But is that going to shift the dial? I don't know.
It's a really challenging one because you could see, practitioners like us would look at some organizational settings and say there's some obvious gaps in how you're supporting employees, or there's some obvious gaps in how you've designed work here. But then in much more evolved organizations, I know professionals come up against the buffers on, well, we've done everything we could think of. Let's do something new. There's always that we need to be implementing new things because of what will people think? What will the employees think? What will our stockholders think? We need to be seen to be doing something rather than, shall we see if that thing we did 2 years ago has actually worked? Because most well-being interventions will take some time to show any kind of a result.
I find the preference for something new and shiny difficult myself to navigate. Both on a personal level, I
Mm.
quite like new and shiny, but also when I'm managing and working with clients, right? Because everyone wants an easy solution. And I think it sounds really boring, but thorough, rigorous, slow, measured work is what moves things, big, insidious issues forward. It's
Mm.
it's you know, when we've seen big differences in this, it has been a long process. It has required multiple stages of listening, building trust, following through on the small changes, support from
Yeah.
managers to do things differently, to be able to support this implement. So yes, all that suite of support that we talked about that might come in brilliant, but only when there are organizational changes alongside it. And I think all too often, new and shiny feels much more performative. So
Yeah.
I think,
Mm.
and I'm being really careful because I have a huge number of clients who are CEOs and senior leaders who care deeply about their teams. But even the best of them will come to me and be like, "Oh, we're going to do this thing," and I'm like, "Brilliant! Why?" And they're like, "Because it looks great."
Mm.
Okay, it might be great. What's it gonna do that's different? What's the difference it's gonna make? But it is so much easier to get to sign off, and I think a lot of people want to be able to say they're doing something because doing nothing feels somehow neglectful.
This is an important point though, because you just touched on it. Often doing nothing isn't doing nothing. It's investigating more thoroughly before doing something new. It's asking more powerful questions and looking at organizational data to make a better decision as to whether something else is needed. So the doing nothing is a critique, but actually a lot of the time it's doing something different that's going to get a better result. And it might delay big noise and big action, but that just contributes to a better outcome at the end of it rather than we did something. Execution is the marker we're looking for, not impact.
I think that's right. And I was thinking about this the other day I was thinking about the workshop, what people did and didn't say, and the extent to which they wanted to share. And they were great. But I was thinking about how often well-being conversations may also have people in them who are worried that they may have inadvertently contributed to the problem, and therefore that adds to the action orientation. Let's not look too deeply at all the things that might be accidentally contributing to it, because I think the idea of the ideal worker. There's this idea,
Mhm.
um, go back sort of, I was going to say 50, but it's probably a lot more than that now. It's probably near 70 years ago,
Mhm.
talking about what the ideal worker is and comparing everybody to the ideal worker. Um, I think that problem exists for managers as well. And I think one of the challenges is I think it's very hard for managers to say, I'm servicing the needs of the organization, but I'm also going to advocate for my team and their work balance and their work content and their fit pace of change for their work. And I
Mm.
think when you dig too deeply at well-being, it's very, very easy to find multiple places where you could swing a hammer. And I don't think that's helpful to anyone, but I think people get nervous about that. So they would far rather be able to go, hey, let's just try this and see if it works. And then maybe we never have to talk about the fact that for a year while we were merging the organizations, we worked everyone down to their socks and didn't give managers enough time to spend one-to-ones, because that feels
Mm.
unhelpful once it's moved forward.
Absolutely. And a lot of the time, the good questions are uncomfortable questions. Whether it's we haven't thought this through and that's uncomfortable, or it's when we know exactly what's detracting from well-being and we don't really want to do anything about that, we'd like a solution that somehow balances that out. And that's why you get intervention fatigue. I think the next new thing and another thing, another layer of action for you to participate in rather than designing good jobs, making sure work is doable or that manager's behavior is appropriate or it's a psychologically safe environment. All the stuff we know contributes to a positive experience of the workplace. That is deeply uncomfortable to re-examine for a whole host of reasons. And so even though commercially create and deploy well-being programs for my clients, I would always start with, but yes, that's something that we could do. Why? Where does this come from? Who wants this? What do you think it's going to do? How do you think it's going to work? What is the key outcome you're looking for here? And they're difficult conversations, but they get you a much better result and a shared understanding, like we've discussed on the podcast before, about, well, what do we mean by well-being in the first place before we go into solutions mode? And even if it's a really good solution because you've been at a conference and you've seen the HRD of a multinational describe their 5-year program and the results. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So even that, it can lead people to feel quite frustrated, to be asked all these questions. But actually, I think it's a necessary part of being an ethical practitioner, to be honest.
I also think sometimes it really helps organizations to understand, n- not borrow and not copy, but understand how organizations who have very different responsibilities to their staff do it. Because actually, what I was thinking about, so I'm really interested, particular area of fascination for me is non desk based work. So people who are
Mm,
working in healthcare situations, people who are working in the caring community, education to some extent, but also things like, oil rigs and submarines and, where the work is not
yeah,
predominantly at a desk. And one of the things that's
yeah.
really interesting about particularly high reliability industries, so industries where fundamentally people can get hurt or die in them in their workplace,
Mm,
is that sometimes you see well-being. In fact, quite often you see well-being sitting right close and center with health and safety. And I think I think the health and safety has been very much forgotten, and well-being's ended up in a different space. And I'm not advocating this. I don't really think it matters as long as there's a consciousness that they are doing the same thing, which is to ensure, number one, work does no harm, and ideally that work is playing a positive role in these people's lives.
yeah.
And I think when you go and you see organizations, particularly remote organizations, where work has to also create your community, so expats and things like that, I think there's something really powerful in seeing about how they approach it because they treat it as a whole holistic thing. How is this person settling into this community? Because we're the reason they're there. And I'm not suggesting
Yeah.
organizations need to do that are desk based, but I think there is something interested about thinking about it differently. And I
Mm,
think there is
mm.
something interesting about also being really a little bit more humble about the extent to which work is the issue, because there are also a whole host of things that happen in our lives where work can play a place of support, but absolutely is not the root cause of it all. It might be as simple as giving managers the flexibility to let me have a half day
Yeah,
because I've got childcare challenges with health
yeah.
in my young people and things like that.
I'd like to loop back though to your point about health and safety and what it is we mean by well-being. I think that's something I'm trying to nudge people along in conversations is that it's, the removal of risk and physical danger. Yes, obviously. And can we please move beyond that? And can we actually move beyond, let's just make sure work doesn't make us sick to let's emphasize the really positive things that can come from work. Your self efficacy, your motivation, your self belief when you solve a problem, a sense of meaning and purpose, a sense of community, depending on the organization, and then the overspill, the positive overspill of skills and attitudes into your personal life. That really does contribute to us feeling like we're thriving rather than I just need to get through today or I just need to get through this week, which is ultimately unsustainable. And you could organize that like a bit of a hierarchy, obviously. Let's make sure work doesn't, really hurt people. Let's make sure work is well designed so it's actually not eroding your well-being. But it's that next step. Let's make sure work has a positive contribution and that we give people the skills, the tools, the environment to kind of do their best, not like have some kind of rolling a rock up the side of a mountain every day with, well, you've got a rock, you've got a mountain, I don't know what you're complaining about, we can see your productivity. It's much more than that, and I think that gets lost because we haven't got a really good answer to who owns well-being except everyone, individual employees, managers, middle management, leadership. Everyone has a responsibility for well-being because it runs all the way through all of an organization's
I
activity.
think it does. And I'm gonna temporarily suggest, just for a moment, we pause on organizations that are doing harm. And let's go with
Hmm.
the most people are trying to do a good thing and are mostly organizing it. And
Hmm.
what I think it's really interesting you say about his responsibility because I've changed dramatically in the last 3 years over how I feel about this. And partially it's because my own well-being's been so affected by work, and partially it's because of the sort of recovery of the economy from COVID and seeing where everyone falls. But I think I have become quite a staunch advocate for individuals understanding at any given point in their life what they want and what they need from work. So I'll give you a very practical example. Um, what I need from work changes with my financial situation. It changes with my partner's job. It changes with what intellectual stimulation I'm getting elsewhere. So when I was doing my master's, I didn't really need intellectual stimulation for my job because I was getting it there. Now I'm doing my doctorate and I have
Mm.
to write it all up. It's very different. I'm like, no, I really need that. But really understanding and learning how to advocate for that and learning how to have that conversation and then teaching managers and leaders how to flip that conversation and receive that conversation, I think is really important because
Mm.
the bit that everyone's uncomfortable about is sometimes jobs just are no longer a good fit for you. And sometimes you can craft them and change the flexibility of the work. Sometimes they're just not a good fit. So for me, the classic example is someone who gets divorced and leaves the family home and was working from home in a busy, bubbly household with lots of social connection and people coming and going to living alone. They may need something very different from work in order to have a
Mm.
healthy, happy life. And I think I'm not suggesting everyone should change their jobs instantly, but it is about how do you then explore that in the organization with your manager and ultimately decide if that job is still serving you to best serve your well-being. I think, and this is not about putting responsibility on individuals because I think organizations have to be open to it and see it as a benefit to them. But I do think if the individual doesn't know what it is that they need and want from their work beyond the job itself, like, so in terms of psychological and emotional needs, I think it's very difficult for people to second guess that. And you just make it so much
Mm.
easier if you've actually done a bit of thinking about what you want from your job beyond a pay rise and more responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's important to recognize there's activity required of people in every part of this organizational model. If individual employees don't want to do any of the things that we know help us, well, they're not going to get a good result. But if leadership don't want to invest in good quality, evidence-based things and make sometimes painful changes in the short term, then they're not going to get a good result either. We can't just lob it at someone and go, this is your problem. But I absolutely agree that individuals benefit from self-awareness and the knowledge of what they can do about that, from small self-care activities that are really in line with their needs, through to having the kind of conversations that they're going to benefit from about their job, about their responsibilities, about their workload. That's all self-care. I argue that all the time. It's it's not just fun and joy. It's also, this is improving my situation, so I need to do it. It's going to be good for me. And this is why I say well-being runs throughout the organization. This is when you're training your managers, it really needs to include a good understanding of human performance, human well-being, so that they can get the best from people without breaking them, and that they can have good quality conversations about well-being or illness or challenges and work flexibly, rather than this isn't listed on the well-being program. I don't know what to do about this. That's why well-being is not an episode. It's not an event. It's a huge area of focus for the organization.
I was just listening to you saying that and thinking, we've got ourselves, and it's a massive grand we. I feel a little bit like organizations often get themselves into a bit of a muddle about performance and what performance looks like and what performance is and what contributes to it. And I think the classic example that I often give is you'll be familiar with the job demands resources model, which I love. For
Mhm.
those of you who haven't come across it, it's basically conceptualizing the idea that there are demands that our roles place on us and that we have resources to meet them. And when those resources are enough to help us meet that role, we're okay. And if we're not, if we're in deficit, it's a problem. Now, one of the things I most find interesting about well-being is there are quite a lot of the things that help us individually with our well-being that might be a resource for us, but a demand for others. So
Mhm.
I've been talking a lot recently about training. And so where training for some people, if it really helps them with their job, feels like a massive resource. And it feels like suddenly they've got this peer networked group of people they've studied with for half a day to really get to the grips. We were talking about safeguarding actually at the time, and how
Mm.
that can feel like such a resource that will, it gives them a whole new sense of energy and effort into their role because they feel more competent, they're getting what they need. But also other people who felt like it was just something they needed to complete in order to get it out the way to do their work. And I think that makes it, I really think that makes it very hard.
It definitely does. And at the same time, I'm going to argue that sometimes that's the equivalent of shining a light, under the skirting boards to say, look what's been hidden here all this time. You haven't got enough people to do this much work. And now that people are finally getting flexibility or working their assigned hours, you can't deliver what it is you've been doing. It really illustrates they've been relying on discretionary effort all this time or goodwill, when in fact that's not how the jobs are designed. And now that people want some of this stuff that improves their well-being, it means the organization can't do what it's promised. Does that
Oh,
make
it made
sense?
we could go on a dangerous place. So there's two things I think that are really important in that. I think, or that relate to that. One is I think employee engagement did us a nasty is the phrase that I use. So I
Okay.
think about 20 years ago, employee engagement in itself, a construct you measure, fine, no problem. Like, we're interested in how people are engaged in their work. But when we think about how society, media, sort of public sort of commentary was around it, it's effectively about extracting additional value that people don't get paid for, right? That's really what I mean. Organizational, there's a concept called organizational citizenship, right? Which is basically, do I do extra and do I bring more than I need to? Now,
Hmm.
I always think about work as an exchange. If I'm doing that and I'm getting back, a job I love and I'm excited about, I'm okay with that. But I think that one of the challenges is that people have seen that as an indicator of the organization winning. Like, oh, look what we're getting out of these people. And I think that we are tired of that. And I think people are exhausted.
Yeah.
So I think that's a proper issue with that. And I think the other thing that's done us a real disservice, and I don't think it's anyone's fault again, is the way manufacturing changed in the last 30 years. So for those of you who are familiar, there's something called just in time, which is basically you get the parts just to the factory in time. You go to just the maximum of efficiency because then you don't have storage responsibility. So if you're building a car, things arrive
Mm.
that morning and they go in the machine on the line that day, right? And the idea is to fine tune the machines so that everything is optimized. I think the problem with that is we're really bad at estimating what the job is, what a task is, how long it takes, and what the repercussions are. And I think we're also really bad for planning for redundancy of time. So human beings aren't machines. You don't oil them and like they
Yeah.
go another 150 units. That's just not how it works. They're much more complex. They need much more different inputs, I guess, if you're going to treat it as a mechanism system.
Hmm.
And I think those two things have kind of both meant that organizations don't recruit jobs to the job they need as a collection of tasks. I think they write, I want someone to solve this problem. I've no idea how long it's going to take, but Dave over there, it's taken him and his two. So maybe I'll just get three more people. And I think,
Yeah.
and look, I'm not judging organizations for that. Like it's really hard to spec and
It is. It's tough
time.
to do.
And there's also
Yeah.
a million ways to do things. But I do think we need to spend more and better time taking data of how long things are taking and deciding if actually we need a new person or if we need a different way to do things because it's not efficient.
I want to jump off that point because I think part of the problem that we face as practitioners and that employees face in their experience of work is that we've borrowed heavily from the physical sciences in these metaphors like stress and resilience. And that leads people to think, well, how far can we push things before something breaks? Rather than, should we be pushing in that direction at all? Because, yeah, people aren't machines. Yeah, machines don't get bored, but people can do things machines will never be able to do. And they're people. And that needs to sit at the very heart of this. They're not belongings. They're not equipment. They're people. And so what we can get from them and what we need to give them is going to be completely different.
I think it is. And this is a place where I actually think conversations about neurodiversity are really going to serve everybody because
Hmm.
there are increasing statistics about how many individuals sit within neurodiverse categories or on the edges of those categories. Um, and what I think there is a huge amount of interest in is understanding how some of the different ways in which people who are neurodiverse think might serve organizations. can always rely on organizations to try and find the win. But I think in doing that, what I actually suspect is that it may be extreme with people who are neurodiverse, but actually all of us would benefit from a better understanding of how our cognitive and emotional functions respond to different things in the workplace so that we could get better at understanding it and we could all I will the ditch I will throw myself in every single time is that generally people don't turn up to spend a day of their time wanting to be miserable and bored and sad.
Causing trouble for
It's
others.
just
Yeah.
not how people show up, even in quite
Yeah.
simplistic jobs. What they do want to do is feel like there's a fair exchange. They do want to feel like they've got good information to understand what good looks like. They do want to feel like they've got an appropriate amount of time and they're not failing. And I worry, one of the biggest things I worry about with well-being is the extent to which people who do not feel like they're succeeding in their job it is affecting their mental health. So I
Mm.
think if an organization set you up for failure, not deliberately, but just because they've not scoped the job right, or they don't understand the job, or they've left too much for you to scope, but not enough freedom to change that, I think that's horrific. The number of good, diligent people I see who come in through our work who are like,
Mm.
I want to do this well, but I just can't. And it's because there's a whole other framework around the organization that doesn't allow them to do that. And I think, for me, that's one of the big things I worry about when I see people.
This is the point about good work being the fundamental for all this organizational design, job design, evaluations of this, effectively looking at what needs to be done and how can it be done sustainably, rather than we've always done it this way, or yeah, let's get three more of him, and it's all done under pressure. It's all, very, very pacey kind of stuff. So it's inevitable that errors and rules of thumb creep into that. But our argument is this is another perspective on well-being, one that looks at that, the real primary focus of what let's try and remove this stuff that we know is bad for people. Before we do anything else, let's try and look at that stuff, the source of stress, of dis-ease. And then, yeah, if you sort all of that stuff, then look at some of the bells and whistles that you've maybe heard about when you were at that conference or you read that book at the airport. Because then you can avoid those fads. Then you can avoid fashions that they might be popular now, but they may not be contextually sensitive for your organization, and you're more likely to get the kind of good results that you'd like to talk about, both to your employees and to your shareholders and everyone else, because you've done something that works, which is what evidence-based practice is all about. E- Even if you don't know for sure, you're measuring, you're evaluating to see how well does this work, and then we can improve it, we can iterate, rather than just do the thing because then tick, well-being is sorted.
I would I'm really interested in some of the data. There's two studies going on that I'm really interested in at the moment. One is around shortened working weeks, and they're doing bio data, so looking at how people sleep, people's weight, people's physical activity changes around that, which is being done down at the
Mm.
University of Sussex, and a bigger one over in the US. And the other one I'm really interested in is around there's a movement called B Corp, which is effectively where organizations change their memorandums and articles, their governing document, to say that they are there, yes, to make profit, but also to service the people, both who they provide for, but also who work in their organization. And, I am an advocate for healthy, thriving organizations from a financial perspective. That's all a good thing.
Mm.
But I think
Mm.
it takes a really brilliant leadership team to say, and our job is also to recognize that when we employ people, we are contributing to society in a meaningful way, and we want that to be positive. So therefore, work should be good for people.
Mm. Absolutely. And it reminds us of one of the core things that we need to remind our clients of, which is improved well-being leads to improved performance. It's not an either or thing. And, it's often the most needed investment when there are performance issues, rather than, well, we'll get performance sorted, then we'll look at well-being. Yeah. It's cart before the horse thinking. So it's one of the fundamentals. And if we put that at the very center of our organizational reason for being, then yeah, absolutely. Well-being would take on a very different
And on
tone,
a
wouldn't it?
very, very business note, the comparative recruitment benefit of hand on heart being known as an organization that believes that when people are at their best, the organization is at their best is, I mean, if in it, like, I appreciate there's lots of industries you can't move around very easily, but for a lot of industries, your competitors, for employees, right? Where your employees go and come from. And it really wouldn't take you a huge amount to be a little bit more competitive, not on how many leisure passes they have, although I'm delighted as a physical activity advocate, I'm delighted about that. But instead on how much do our people believe that their well-being is really in this organization's interest, not just performative, or not just in service of the organization.
Lots of those things, you mentioned neurodiversity, lots of those things that get the attention of an organization actually, yes, benefit that community, but benefit everyone. Good job design benefits everyone. Um, Looking after employees with chronic conditions, as we've discussed recently on the podcast, those kinds of flexibility and understanding and consideration, everyone benefits from that stuff. So yeah, I guess we're saying once again, well-being isn't a day in the diary, but more it's a responsibility of pretty much everyone. It's just that in this conversation, some people have more decision-making power than others, but yet the people who have less of that, we can also equip them with skills and self-awareness to do a bit more of that looking after themselves, kind of despite maybe what's going on around them. Definitely not the thing that you and I can solve in under 45 minutes.
Oh, I wish. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
But then we wouldn't have any more
Absolutely.
episodes. In the interest of time, we need to wrap up, but is there anything you haven't shared that you would be kicking yourself later on if you didn't share on this episode?
I think the only thing I would say is a plea to anyone who is thinking about spending their organization's hard-earned money on well-being interventions, of just taking a minute and actually asking yourself, what are you assuming or hoping is going to be different materially if you do this? Even that question alone, I feel like would help people really think through if it was worth the spend or if it was better spent somewhere else, elsewhere in the organization that might better improve well-being.
A brilliant perspective, a great question, one we need to be asking a little bit more. If you have been listening to this and you found it interesting or thought-provoking or a bit challenging, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us an email, podcast@worklifepsych.com. I'm going to be sharing a whole bunch of resources in the show notes, linking back to Jane and the work that she does, and linking back to our Thriving at Work hub online, which links to some of these resources we've been talking about. And if there's anything you'd like to see there in particular, a topic you'd like us to address, again, drop us an email or contact us on any of the socials. But for now, Jane, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to chat with you, and it brought me back some really nice memories from our workshop in Edinburgh. I hope it won't be too long before we get to do something like that again.